Britain's resident doctors have voted overwhelmingly to go on a 5-day strike this Wednesday, rejecting a last-minute offer from the government. The online poll went out over the weekend after Health Secretary Wes Streeting offered to increase the number of training places for resident doctors and to cover the costs of various professional exams that resident doctors are required to take to achieve career progression. So sort of some wins for the resident doctors. However, he would not reopen the issue of headline pay, and the response has been resounding. I was actually surprised at how resounding it was. So on a turnout of 65%, 83% of BMA resident doctors voted to reject the government's last-minute offer. And I think the size of that mandate is important because there had been speculation sort of saying about the BMA, the government had sort of been suggesting this, that putting it out to an online vote wasn't good enough. There should be a proper referendum so that people have a chance to get involved. But this is a big turnout and the response is overwhelming. So I don't think they can really be criticised on the process. Let's see what Wes Streeting had to say about the resident doctor's decision.
Well, the BMA said that their dispute was about pay, so the government gave the resident doctors a 28.9% pay rise. They then said it was about jobs because of the competition for training places being around 4-1. So we offered thousands more training places and emergency legislation to reduce the competition down to less than 2-1. I think it's now clear that what these strikes are really about is the BMA's totally unrealistic demand for another 26% on top of the 28.9% pay rise they've already had. Not only do I think that is unreasonable and obviously unaffordable, I offered to postpone these strikes, to reschedule them for January because of the enormous risks to patients and the NHS at the worst possible time given the enormous pressures we're seeing and the disruption caused by flu. The BMA have chosen to strike this week not only to cause maximum impact and damage to the NHS, but choosing to do so at a time when there is the maximum risk to patients. I think that is irresponsible and I think it's dangerous. And even now, if the BMA want to reschedule to January, the government will facilitate that.
So as Streeting suggested there, the main issue for the resident doctors does seem to be about pay. So Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, has refused to negotiate on pay this year, saying that the 28% that doctors were awarded last year was higher than other public sector workers and could not be revisited or repeated. That 28% was spread over 3 years and backdated. The resident doctors argue this still leaves them earning 20% in real terms than they were earning in 2008. So on this measure, while their recent pay rises have been good, relative to other workers, very good, that doesn't make up for a terrible decade or so of pay erosion. Interestingly, lots of dispute about how much their pay has fallen because it all depends on how you measure inflation. So the Doctors' Union uses the retail price index to measure inflation, which includes mortgage repayments. The government and the Bank of England now use the consumer price index to measure inflation, which doesn't. This sounds very technical, but it does sort of matter in terms of the claims being made. CPI, so the Consumer Price Index, tends to be lower than RPI. According to the Nuffield Trust, if you use CPI as the measure of inflation, as the Bank of England does, then doctors' pay is only down 5% since 2008. And using the CPI measure, doctors' pay is actually up 8% from 2015. And the government argues that as CPI is the updated measure, so sort of what the ONS uses, that's how inflation and therefore real pay should be measured. The union, though, I do have to say, have a strong argument up their sleeve, though, which is this. The interest payments on their whopping student loans are linked to RPI, not CPI. So you can say the government is saying, well, use the low CPI measure for your pay and the high RPI measure for your interest payments. And that does, to me, seem a little bit sneaky. The absolute amount of pay also does matter, though. And as this chart shows from the BBC, doctors aren't badly paid. So after the 3-year pay rise agreed last year, doctors earn £38,000 in their first year and will likely be earning over £70,000 after around 8 years in the profession. Once you get to the consultant position, you're often on 100k and more. So that's pay. The doctors' other big issue was on jobs and training places. The issue here was that to become a consultant, which is where the real good money is, you need to complete a specialist training program. So it'll be a couple of years or so training as a GP or an anaesthetist or a psychiatrist or whatever specialism you want to go in. And those have become harder and harder to get on. So as an example, there are now 5 applicants for every 1 GP training placement. So that means that if you want to advance in your career, it's become harder than it used to be. That's partly in response to there being more medical students than there used to be. Also because since Brexit, when we had a massive liberalisation of immigration rules, there are more international doctors applying for these posts. In response, so Wes Streeting said, I'm not negotiating on pay, but in response to this, he's pledged to increase the number of training places and to introduce legislation giving priority to British applicants when it comes to these coveted specialist training positions. The chair of the BMA Resident Doctors Committee chair was asked last week about whether Streeting's new offer represented a good deal.
People waiting for operations and worried about their health are now very anxious about what might happen. And if you stand back, you look at the fact that you've got pay rises of nearly 30% over 3 years, 4,000 new training posts, exam fees paid, UK doctors given priority over international medical graduates. I mean, what is your issue here? You said it's a mixed bag. It sounds like a pretty good deal, doesn't it?
So, you talk about patients. If we go back to October, where there were no strikes, 54,000 patients without flu or anything else were lying in corridors waiting for care in A&E corridors. And that was just in 1 month.
And that would be exacerbated by your strike
we don't have
action.
enough doctors. So we don't have enough doctors, and this deal does not increase the number of doctors in this country. We have fewer doctors than other comparable EU countries. We've been trying to ask the Health Secretary to get back around the table since the last round of industrial action. He chose not to and only engage in conversation from 9 a.m. on Sunday morning. That is very much on him. We've been wanting to get a deal over the line since I took office on the 13th of October. And sadly, despite repeated attempts to get the Health Secretary to round the table, they've fallen on deaf ears.
So I showed you what he said last week because I don't think they've done much of a media round since this vote. I did obviously also email the BMA, but they couldn't put someone forward today, which is fair enough. I'm sure they're very busy people, especially on a day like today.
I'm here in their stead.
You're here in their stead.
Yeah.
So can you pretend to be a resident doctor?
Yeah.
Why are you going on strike?
It's just the economy. They can't knock down hospitals.
What do you think about it? Go on. Tell me your opinion on this doctor's strike.
Yeah, you brought me on a challenging episode. Yeah. I'm not going to lie.
They're all challenging.
They are all challenging, to be fair. I mean, I was reading in the Guardian, they described the strike as public support for it having evaporated, which is, I mean, in that sense, I actually I have more respect for them because of the total lack of public support. At least, I mean, that's they're not playing to anyone now. They're really sticking to their guns, which I do respect.
Like late era Just Stop Oil.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's hard, isn't it? I mean, they get paid quite well. They got a pretty big pay rise. I guess my question, and maybe there's an answer to this, is if they are striking because their pay is still below 2008 level, why they accepted the initial pay packet? Why didn't they just keep striking until they got that?
They said when they got the 28%, that Wes Streeting indicated that this would be part of a journey to full pay restoration.
Right.
And so the argument they're making is that by not continuing that journey this year, because I think between this year and next year, they're maybe being offered something like 2%, which they say is a real pay cut because of inflation. So they're saying, we were promised a journey, but the journey has ended too soon.
Right.
So they want it to keep going up. And then Wes Streeting in response says, but you did get a bigger rise than everyone else. The nurses went on strike and then accepted 5% and aren't going on strike again.
So I'm starting to think now it might be the doctor's fault because you don't trust a man with gelled hair like Wes Streeting.
If they'd have not accepted the 28% and then continued striking then, people would have talked about like losing support. You had to accept the 28%. So I can see why they'd say we'll accept the 28% and then we will try and,
trust
continue that journey the following year. I mean,
I see. So they were like, it's in stages. We're like stage 2 now.
Exactly.
And now Wes Streeting, gelled hair,
every stage they go on strike.
Yeah.
I do think, so I suppose to be a bit controversial, because I know doctors as well, and I love them, but I do think there probably is if you're so why aren't the nurses going on strike? Why did the nurses accept 5% and they're not going on strike? Because they've also accepted quite a lot of pay erosion.
Yes.
And the doctors have a reasonably good deal relative to other people working in the NHS, but still go on strike. And I do think there probably is an element of entitlement.
I think I see what you're saying, and I think I broadly agree with you. I think it doesn't sit super easy when it's like, if everyone else's pay had gone up to 2008 levels and doctors hadn't, I'd be like, yeah, absolutely. But we're sort of, everyone else's pay is shit as well. And so it's maybe a little bit like, we're all in this together.
They say that pay in the private sector it hasn't gone down since 2008. It's not much higher than it was. But so they'd say that in the private sector, pay has been restored to 2008 levels, but not for them as doctors.
Right.
But I think as doctors, they're doing quite well relative to nurses. It's one of those issues where it all depends on who you compare yourself to.
And how many doctors you know.
And how many doctors you know.
Because they
but
might
also,
beat you up.
and what your parents did. So I think there's also an issue where they think, oh, my parents are doctors, and they used to have a really top, like when you watch like American TV shows and the doctors are sort of like, they're like top corporate lawyers.
Yeah.
And they're a
well
surgeon
groomed.
that people know by name.
Yeah.
And they get really good pay. And I think that the NHS doctors feel like they're underappreciated compared to the status they deserve, which there's probably some truth to, but also I see why public support has evaporated. I have to say, I was kind of hoping they were going to vote to
not do it.
To not do it this time around. Because it does seem like some of the offers made were reasonable, especially in terms of paying for exam costs. But
yeah,
I don't know. I do want to get. This isn't like I'm challenging the BMA to a debate, but I just mean if it doesn't,
don't make me pretend to be a resident doctor again.
I will try and keep emailing them because I would love to get them on.
Yeah. Just don't play them the bits that I've said because I'm worried they'll really go after me.
Yeah. No, I do want to get them back on because someone's saying nurses aren't striking because their union is ineffective. Loads of union nurses are from overseas on precarious visas, so won't strike. I do think there is an element of people think I'm worth this.
Yeah.
Student loans are also a big, deal. They do have a lot in fees, and they have to pay a high
student
interest
loan
rate.
thing you said about CPI and RPI, that seems like a slam dunker.
We have fewer doctors compared to lots of comparable countries. So this is what that fellow was saying on, I think it was Channel 4 News, saying that the pledge from Wes Streeting, while it does create more training places, doesn't actually increase the number of doctors because they're just converting what would be temporary jobs into training jobs. So this is how many doctors there are per 1,000 inhabitants in a number of countries they've chosen. So I assume that's Austria, 5.5 per 1,000 people. In Norway, 5.2. Spain, 4.6. Germany, 4.5. Italy, 4.1. France, 3.4. And then Britain, we're not doing very well on 3.2. So we should have a lot more doctors than we do. The Americans, the Koreans, the Chinese and the Indians have fewer than us. And that is despite us taking lots of doctors from our other medical systems. So this is from a recent article by Fraser Nelson in The Times. So he says, demand for medicine surged this year, so that's as a degree, not for physical medicine. 25,800 applications for 8,130 places. Rising demand has hit the immovable object of government-capped places at a time when the NHS is chronically short of doctors. It's a tragic waste of potential. We are often told the NHS would collapse without immigrant doctors. That is true, but only because Britain has chosen to import roughly 20,000 doctors a year while rejecting about 16,000 med school applicants. About 1 in 6 of Nigeria's registered doctors now works in Britain, as do 1 in 10 of Pakistan's. The ethics of raiding the workforce of countries suffering doctor shortages is questionable, but the arithmetic is not. Training a doctor costs the state about £160,000. Importing is cheaper. A more honest rejection letter might simply say, your grades are great, you probably are too, but our system is fundamentally broken. Now this, I think, is just a very clear moral failing of our system, which is we are, I would respect it if, a poorer country say we can't afford to train our doctors, so we're going to import doctors from other countries. But if we're saying we're a richer country, we can't afford to train our doctors, so we're going to take them from Nigeria. Yeah. Is like, obviously all power to the Nigerian doctors coming and propping up the NHS. But as a system, that strikes me as fundamentally immoral, given we are the richer country in the in the arrangement.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that is just a microcosm of modern Britain, isn't it? It's cheaper imports versus actual home investment. I mean, I'd never seen it laid out like that. And you're like, yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, look, it's like Starmer saying, sticking plaster politics is gone. Clearly not. I mean, that's, like you said before, you even get into the morality of stealing poorer countries' doctors. It's just a crap system.
I think the doctors, I think this is a very sort of normie thing to say, but I think they have a lot of reasons to strike, but probably by making it all about pay when they're reasonably well paid. That's not, because if they'd made it about the training places, if they'd made it about, they work horrible hours.
Yeah.
And especially if you're working in a system where, you're trying to do your job well and you can't because it's underfunded and because it's all creaking at the seams. I can see why you're miserable in your job. And especially if you're miserable in your job and you've worked really hard to get that job, you want to get well paid for that job. But I do think that the argument would be stronger if instead of saying this is about pay, they said this is actually about these things.
But also, you allow the government the free pass. It works both ways, doesn't it? If you make it about pay, the government can easily just be like, well, you've got a 28% pay rise.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Which is on the you say that to most people in the public, they're going to be like, oh, really? They got 28% pay rise? Then of course they can't get another one.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
I don't think Wes Streeting is feeling particularly under pressure here.